Geobiama, an Amazonian scientific expedition. The research partnership from the Finland-Brazilian Geobiama project is currently focusing efforts on the acquisition of new data that can contribute to discuss the impact of geological processes on the distribution of modern plant species in the Amazonian ecosystem. The northern part of this region, in particular the Negro Branco River Basin, constitutes a natural laboratory appropriated to undertake such studies. This is because this area contains a large amount of triangular-shaped paleolandforms related to megafans that record a past landscape that differs significantly from the modern fluviatile environment. Testimonies of such ancient environments include geographically widespread accumulations of sandy sediments that were transported into this region by drainage systems no longer active in Amazonia. Data collected so far by the Geobiama project indicate that sedimentary dynamics associated with the evolution of megafans during the late Pleistocene-Holocene played a fundamental role to barrier the colonization of rainforest species, at the same time that it created a favorable terrain to the introduction of various types of white sand vegetation varying from grasses, shrubs to forest. All these issues can be approached with the investigations that are being carried out on the Virua megafan, which is a widespread wetland in the southern state of Roraima. It is to this area that the Geobiama researchers return to continue their geological and botanical investigation.
Last year, during the same dry season that we have today, we were here in the Virua National Park, in the same area, close to these mountains, which makes the end of our major object of study in this area, which is the Virua megafan. And by that time, we collect a lot of data in this area, trying to understand better how we could understand the evolution of this depositional system and what would be the impact that differences in morphology and also associated with the hydrological regime could have in the distribution of plant species throughout this area. We know that the plant species here is very variable, and we want to understand why we have so many changes, considering areas like this one here, where we have a lot of flooding and we have a predominance of grassland campinaranas, like we can see here, and this change into areas that is dominated by forest campinaranas. We made a lot of analysis so far, and we know today that we have parts of the megafan that are exposed at the surface and represent older surfaces associated with the depositional processes that resulted in the widespread distribution of sand throughout all this area here, up to that mountain, which represents the end of this megafan. To continue our project in this area, we brought now our complete team, including the international partners, which is coordinated by Dr. Hanna Tuomisto. And they are specialists in botany, and they study some particular type of taxonomic groups. And they are doing that throughout several other areas of the Amazon. And now they want to compare how these species can be associated with the megafauna, can be distinguished if they have some relationship with areas such as those mountains that we can see at the background, where we have a forest developed upon Precambrian basement. That means much older basement rocks. Here we have a sedimentation that is pretty young. The age of the megafauna that we are dating so far, it's almost entirely comprising the late Pleistocene and Holocene geological time. So we have a very long time in between those areas compared to these areas here. And we are comparing the plant groups from the mountain areas and now in all the outside areas surrounding these megafauna systems. And during this present expedition, they have collected a lot of data from the surrounding area as well as from the area, several forests that we have inside of the megafauna. We have a very young sedimentation that wasn't recognized, that was so important before. And then the biologists now can start to understand probably the importance of this new geological setting and the implications that this can have to understand plant distribution throughout the Amazon region, particularly considering this flooded area, the wetland areas.
To complete the geological studies, Dr. Hanna Tuomisto, who is a botanist from the Turku University in Finland, went to the Virua megafauna to undertake her investigation. In her studies, Dr. Tuomisto has focused on detailing particular plant groups that are helpful for characterizing the Amazonian vegetation, such as ferns.
Okay, so we have been doing these floristic inventories in Virua for a few days now. And it has been quite interesting in the sense that there have been several species that I have not seen anywhere else before. We are now next trying to figure out the identities, so we have collected specimens in order to identify them later in the herbarium. The general diversity in species numbers is not very high. It's only a few species in any one transect. But the distribution of the species has been quite interesting. So there is quite a lot of variation in the forests. There are some that are taller, some are less tall, denser, more open, some with obvious marks of inundations and others more dry. And the species seem to be zonated pretty well according to the conditions, which we of course need to figure out in more detail later. But it's a very interesting pattern we're getting in here. And it's quite intriguing also that out of this few species that we have seen so far, there's a very high proportion of species that I don't remember having seen it anywhere else in Amazonia.
Dr. Kali Hukolainen, who is also part of Dr. Tuomisto's team at the University of Turku, is also interested in the understanding of plant species distribution along and surrounding the Virua megafauna with a main emphasis on Melastoma.
The one thing that Amazonian rainforest is certainly is its high species richness. When it comes to the number of species of trees or plants in general, the number is something like 50,000 or perhaps a bit lower, but anyway, a very high number. That's fascinating as such, but of course it means that it's quite difficult to investigate the variation, geographical variation in floristic composition because of the high species number. And that's actually where our part of this project comes in, because what we are proposing is that if we are interested about variation, geographical variation in species composition, how the species composition in plants varies from one place to another, it's actually not necessary to tally all the species, all the plant species. It's enough if you have only one part of the flora. And if you enter the forest that has perhaps 1,000 plant species per hectare, the part of the flora that you choose had better to be a part that is easy to recognize. And the part that, or one part that we have chosen is the family Melastomataceae. Those are shrubs, which makes it easy to work with because you don't need to climb up. And the nice thing of them is that the leaf venation pattern is like this. It's like fishbone system or a ladder or something. Very regular, parallel secondary veins parallel to the main vein, and then tertiary veins that are nicely ordered. And always leaves opposite. And when you have seen one of this family, then you actually recognize immediately when you go to the forest that, okay, this plant is Melastomataceae, this plant is not. And the number of Melastomataceae species in the whole Amazonia is about 500, 500 or so. And that's already something that you can handle. One person can more or less learn the number of species. And then the nice thing is that if the trees and other plants are saying that this forest is very similar to that, but very different from the third one, if that is the story by trees, if you follow the melastomes, actually the story is exactly the same. So if you want to know how the flora changes from one place to another, you don't need to follow the whole flora. It's enough if you choose an indicator species group, and Melastomataceae is one of them. Another is ferns.
The Brazilian team also has botanists who have undertaken a cooperative work with the Finnish researchers, aiming to complete the characterization of vegetation types on the Virua megafan. This task has been approached under the leadership of Dr. Rogerio Gribel from the National Institute for Amazonian Research, INPA.
Our studies have shown that the forests have different pathways of regeneration. In some cases, the forest originates in paleodunes, in other cases in the valleys, and in the other cases, quite recently, some forests are colonizing the channels. The complexity of this process is very big, very large, so it's necessary multidisciplinary studies, and we work in collaboration between Brazilian institutions, Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas Espaciais, INPE, Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas da Amazônia, INPA, and Turku University from Finland. So this multidisciplinary approach is showing that in this national park we have a very dynamic process combining geological process and ecological process, which explain the current landscape in the region.
Among the community of tree species from the Virua megafan, many are well known from the local population.
This tree produces edible fruits, and the latex is used by local population as food. They use this latex, cook this latex with rice, is very appreciated by local population.
And then we wrote a big project in a partnership with INPE, which is the National Institute for Space Research at São José dos Campos, and there, in collaboration with Dilce Rossetti, which is a geologist, we start to look into how the geological formations can help to understand the distribution of these plants in Amazonia. Dilce has been given an amazing contribution with her expertise in the topic, combined with Hanna and Kale have been working on. We are now at the Virua Park, or the Roraima area, better saying, trying to figure out how this area has, what is the influence of these geological formations for the distribution of pteridophytes. And this is such a great experience for me as a PhD student at the University of Turku to join this expedition. It will have like beneficial, like several benefits for my formation as a research.
At the end of the field campaign, Dr. Tuomisto came out with a few preliminary results of high interest to reach the main objectives of the Geobiama project.
Yeah, well, we have now 2 weeks of field experience behind in Virua, and it has been very interesting to share experiences between the geological and the botanical group, because we approach things from very different points of view. And for the botanical part, it's of course very nice to see what all the differences are between the different geological formations. It has been very illuminating to see how these megafan sediments are very different from the sediments that we have and the other substance we have on the older formations, and how the flora changes in those as well. So there is a very distinct flora in this megafan formation. And for the plant groups that we're working with, it seems that most of the things that we see on the dune areas, they are basically white sand soil species. And then in much of the other open area, for the ferns, there is not much diversity at all. It seems to be getting too extreme with a combination of very poor soils and rather extreme changes in drainage. And then on relatively similar surfaces, when the topography changes, we do get the forested areas and then a different set of species. And it will be very interesting to compare the botanical data and the geological data in order to see what exactly is the history of the different areas and how the surface sediments actually differ from each other, both in their sedimentation processes and in terms of the soil chemistry, which is the thing that plants mainly react to together with drainage. So we have been measuring topography in different places and obtaining botanical and geological data from basically the same sites, or at least nearby sites, in order to combine this. And we expect, when we get a better handle on the species, we have now of course seen some species that we don't know. Many of the species are known from other parts of Amazonia already, but there are some that we have seen on the megafan area that are new to us, that we don't really know what their ecological requirements are in general and where in space they occur outside the Virua fan. So there will be some rather interesting biogeography and ecology to be got from there. And of course it's quite an interesting question to think about, where did this megafan area get its flora. So when the sediments deposited, it was a very different environment from what it is now, probably. And it was also a very different environment from what there was in the area before, because these megafan sediments, they are sandy and they are rather poor. They are siliceous material. They are white sands, much of it, which is in stark contrast with the red earth we have on the older surfaces and on the hills that still crop out from the megafan areas. So those hill areas, they are geologically very different from the surroundings. So the species that are growing on the hills, they were there from before, but the ones that came on the megafan itself, they must have come from somewhere else, because they didn't have a source pool in the area, as the area in general had a different soil structure, different sediments on top. And it will be very interesting to see kind of what the biogeographical connections of the species are that do occur on the megafan area. And then on the other hand, also these higher areas, the older surfaces of terrain, the mountains, the serras inside the megafan, which are geologically very different, their connections, the connections of their flora to the outside is also an interesting question in what are their closest relationships, which are the areas that they are most closely related to in floristic terms, and what are the biogeographical affinities of the species that we can find on those surfaces. And there also seems to be a pretty interesting kind of difference in the diversity patterns of the two plant groups we're looking at. We're looking at ferns on the other one hand and the family Melastomataceae on the other. And the ferns are mostly herbs and the Melastomataceae are mostly woody. And there clearly is a kind of complementary distribution pattern of those groups in this area, so that in those parts where we find lots of ferns, there usually are not very many Melastomataceae, and when there are many Melastomataceae, there are rather few ferns. So if we put those groups together, we always have some representation, which is kind of nice because we are trying to use these two plant groups as indicators of different forest types. And then, of course, it's nice to always have them present, because if you're trying to identify a forest type like this by looking at what are the plants that grow on the understory, and then your indicator plants are not there, then it's not a very handy system for identifying the forest type. Then you need to look for another indicator group that is present in the forest in order to see that, okay, we have that species, so we're talking about this kind of forest. So there are some areas which have been very poor in ferns, especially these open areas in the megafan area, which seem to be too extreme. Ferns mostly, they like to have some shade, and in those open vegetation areas you don't have shade, so we don't get ferns in there. But then many Melastomataceae can tolerate full sun, so then on those areas we still get Melastomataceae. And then when we go to certain other surfaces, we get many ferns, but then we don't get so many Melastomataceae. So when we're working with both of these plant groups together, we get a more complete picture of the floristic variation than we would get with either group on just its own.
In addition to geological and botanical data, a large amount of samples were collected during the field campaign, which are currently being processed at different laboratories. The next step will be the integration of all these data in order to model plant species distribution along the Virua megafan. Researchers from the Geobiama project also aim to analyze how this model can be applied to help explaining the occurrence of similar vegetation patterns that typify many other megafans recently recognized in the northern Amazonian wetlands.